Okay, so this is section 1.6. We're solving absolute value equations and inequalities this afternoon. I hope we're all relaxed and ready for this lesson.
We are.
All right. First and foremost, let's talk about what an absolute value is. One idea is an absolute value of a number is just the distance that number is from zero. In other words, it's the size of a number, ignoring its direction or sign. All right? Another idea you might want to think about, it could be just the general difference between two numbers, disregarding who's larger. You'll talk more about that in classes like chemistry. All right. Folks, absolute value, we use these little bars on each side of the number, and you know this, I think, right? Folks, when you see the absolute value of 5, really what that means is, how far is 5 from 0? All right? Similarly, if I say the absolute value of negative 7, well, golly, that means how far is negative 7 from 0? All right? Well, what happens if I have the absolute value of 8 minus 11? Well, two things. Number one, this isn't a distance from 0. This just means what's the difference between 8 and 11? And I don't care who's bigger. Does it make sense why the answer to that one is 3? Actually, I'm a bad boy. I should have done this. Folks, does it make sense why the first one is 5 and the second one is 7? All right? Lastly, if I say what's the absolute value of 11 minus 8, well, gosh, that's the same thing as the previous question. It basically means what's the difference between 8 and 11? It's 3, right? Okay? Where I don't care who's bigger, right? Okay. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, moral of the story actually, though, is on these two problems, you can't take the absolute value of two numbers inside. You can only take the absolute value of one number, so you have to do the math to get into one number first. Take a look at some examples here. In this example, it says, what's the absolute value of 12? Well, how far is 12 from 0? 12 spaces. How far is negative 4 from 0? 4 spaces. How far is negative 3.8 from 0? 3.8 spaces. Right? Looking at some evaluating problems, if I've got the absolute value of this expression, 3x minus 7, this has to take negative 2 and plug it in for this x. So I get 3 times negative 2 inside the absolute value is minus 7. Folks, again, I need to do all the math inside of here. Folks, really pay attention to this problem right here. A lot of students misunderstand what they're allowed to do here. This is negative 6 minus 7, right? Well, again, I cannot take the absolute value of negative 6 and negative 7 at the same time. I have to get this down to a single number. That's the absolute value of negative 13, and that absolute value is just 13, okay? Now, look at this one. This one looks similar to the previous problem in the fact that I have the same expressions, 3x and 7, but notice it's slightly different in how the absolute values are written. I've got two different absolute values. This says find the absolute value of 3 times negative 2, and then subtract the absolute value of 7. Well, that's the absolute value of negative 6 minus the absolute value of 7. Well, the absolute value of negative 6 is 6. The absolute value of 7 is 7. So when you do this problem, your final answer is negative 1. Notice the difference between problems D and E. Okay? All right, now let's jump into the meat of this lesson, and that's solving absolute value equations and inequalities. Folks, you need to remember that when you solve an absolute value equation or inequality, you must give every possible number that works. I'm sorry, whenever you solve any equation, you have to give every possible number that works. Take a look at some three basic problems. This says interpret and solve each equation and inequality. The first one says the absolute value of x equals 4. Well, in English, my interpretation of that is what number or numbers are 4 spaces from 0? Well, on a number line, I'm thinking that could be, the zeros here, it could be 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces to the right, so 4 could be an answer, or 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces to the left. So negative 4 could be an answer. So there are two choices. X could equal 4, or x could equal negative 4. Everybody see that? The next problem says the absolute value of x is less than 3. Well, again, in English, what that says is what number or numbers are less than 3 spaces from 0 on a number line? Okay? All right. Well, if you think about it, on a number line, here's 0, 1, 2, 3 to the left, right? 1, 2, 3 to the left. What numbers would be less than 3 spaces? Well, starting at -3, it'd be all these numbers. Starting at +3, it'd be all these numbers. So it'd be all the numbers between -3 and 3. So it'd be from -3 to +3, excluding those two numbers. And that's how you write, remember, that's how you write interval notation, which is just a lazy man's number line. Okay? Look at one more example. Now this one says, in English, what numbers are more than 5 spaces from 0. Okay? Well, again, on a number line, I would have, here's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, in this case, what numbers would be greater than 5 spaces from 0s? Starting at 5, wouldn't it be all the numbers to the right, like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, like that, right? And starting on -5 on the left, what numbers would be further than that? All the numbers further than that would be -6, -7, and so on, right? So in this case, I have two actual representations. It would be from -infinity to -7, excluding the -7, so parentheses, union, all the numbers from 5 to infinity, again, excluding those two numbers. Right? I hope this makes sense so far. Because of these simple ones, hopefully we can come up with some general ideas. So now let's look at some general rules based off of these observations. Right? You know, these simple equations and inequalities, they tell me that when I have an absolute value equation, there's always two answers. There's a possibility that that absolute value can represent the number to the left of a 0, or it can be to the right of 0. Similarly, with inequalities, you can do the same thing, but in this case, you would have multiple answers, so you'd have to have shaded regions on your number line. Okay? So let's take a look at this. Number 1, you always want to isolate your absolute value first, right? Make sure at this point the equation or inequality makes sense. Remember, the absolute value is a distance, so it can't be negative. The next thing that you want to do is write two equations or inequalities. Okay? One assuming that the absolute value quantity is positive, and one assuming that it's negative. And then you just want to solve each equation or inequality. Remember that for inequalities, your solution has to be in interval notation. Folks, in general, with those absolute values, I always think of this phrase. Dos palitos, dos problemas. Dos palitos, dos problemas. Notice that it says dos palitos, not dos problemas. Problemas, not
Dos respuestas.
It's not about the answers, it's about the problems that get me to the answers. So you always have to do two
Respuestas.
Thank you. Okay, so let's do this. Ladies and gentlemen, let's solve this absolute value equation I have in A. It says absolute value of 2x minus 1 plus 3 equals 5. The first thing I need to do is isolate this absolute value. So I subtract 3 from both sides. I get the absolute value of 2x minus 1 equals 2. At this point, I'm going to use the first palito to create the first problema. It would be 2x minus 1 equals 2. And the second one is 2x minus 1 equals negative 2. All right? Again, the first one is assuming that I'm to the right of 0, 2 spaces. And the second one is assuming that the absolute value is of the number to the left 2 spaces. Doesn't matter which order you go in. All right? By the way, I'm a bad boy. I should have said, first and foremost, does this equation right here make sense? Can I have an absolute value equaling a positive 2? Sure. Right? If this had been a negative 2 to start with, right there, it would have been impossible. Okay? And I wouldn't have had to solve it. All right, now just go through and I solve each problema. All right? Adding the 1 across, I get 2x is equal to 3. So x equals 3 halves. On the other hand, if I solve this one, I get 2x equals negative 1. So x equals negative a half. So my two answers to this are 3 halves and negative 1 half. You guys try B on your own. Make sure that it makes sense. All right, and we're back. And so now I've got the absolute value of 2x plus 6 equals 3x plus 4. Notice that my absolute value is already alone, so I'm ready to split him up into the two problems. Okay? On this one, the first problem will be 2x plus 6 equals 3x plus 4. And the second problem is 2x plus 6 equals negative 3x minus 4. Notice that I had to change every number, every sign on the outside. That's the rule. You have to change every sign on the outside, which I will allude to again later, right? Now, solving the first equation, I subtract 2x across, I get 6 equals x plus 4. Subtracting the 4, I get x equals 2. So one of the answers is x equals 2. On the other problem, I'm going to add 3x across this time. I'm going to get 5x plus 6 equals negative 4. So I get 5x equals negative 10. So x equals negative 2. All right? So my answer is x equals 2 and x equals negative 2. Folks, be careful. I have to check both of these actually in this to make sure that both answers work. Sorry. I need to check and make sure that both answers work before I box them. Folks, if I plug a 2 in for this x here and for this x here, if you have an x on the outside of the absolute value, you've got to make sure that what you get is a true statement. If I do the math in the left side, I would get the absolute value of 4 plus 6, which is the absolute value of 10, which is 10. On the right side, I get that 3 times 2 plus 4, which is 6 plus 4, which is 10. Does 10 equal 10? Yes. So I know that x equals 2 is an answer. Checking out in the negative 2, if I plug negative 2 in, I get absolute value of 2 times negative 2 plus 6. Well, that would be absolute value of negative 4 plus 6, which is absolute value of 2, which is 2. On the right side, plugging in a negative 2, I get 3 times negative 2 plus 4 is equal to negative 6 plus 4, which is equal to negative 2. Oh, wait a minute. Does negative 2 and 2 equal each other? No. So even though x equals negative 2 is one of the options, since he doesn't work, he's extraneous, we just cross him out. So when do I have to check? Ultimately, if you see an x on the outside of the absolute values, you need to check and make sure that the numbers you plug in work. Okay? All right, let's take a look at the next problem. I've got the absolute value of 3x plus 1, and then minus 4 is less than or equal to 4. Again, the first thing I need to do is isolate my absolute value, so I add the 4 across, so I get 3x plus 1 in absolute values is less than or equal to 8. I write my two problems, I get 3x plus 1 is less than or equal to 8. But on the other hand, I have to go 3x plus 1 could be, again, greater than or equal to negative 8. Notice, when you create this second palito, the second problem, you have to change the sign of the 8 and change the sign of that inequality, because again, you change all the signs, and this inequality sign is a sign. All right, now solving the first one, I get 3x is less than or equal to 7, so x is less than or equal to 7/3. All right, if you want to think about that, that's the same thing as, what is that, 2 1/3? So x has to be less than or equal to 2 1/3. All right. On the other hand, if I solve this, I get 3x is greater than or equal to negative 9, so x has to be greater than or equal to negative 3. Again, with inequalities, I'm going to look at this on a number line. I would get, let's see here, my two numbers were negative 3 was one answer, 2 1/3 was the other answer. Okay, I circle both those. It could be both because it's inclusive, it's equal to, so I color those in. Now let's take a look at the shading on this. The first says x has to be less than 2 1/3. Well, that's this way. Greater than negative 3 would be this way, right? What numbers are between them? These numbers here. So my final answer is negative 3, comma, 2 1/3, or 7/3, however you want to put it, with brackets on each one. Okay? So, real quick, I'm just going to set you up with the next one. On this one, you would get 5 minus 2x is greater than 3 versus 5 minus 2x is less than negative 3. Okay? Go ahead and solve each one of those, and we'll talk about those along with these last two problems. Try this one and this one on your own. We'll talk about them tomorrow. Bye.